Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So this video is one in a series focusing on kids' sleep. In the current video, I'll be discussing the sleep that kids get across a 24-hour period. Specifically, I'll discuss the recommended amount of sleep and the actual amount of sleep that kids get across a 24-hour period, as well as provide a brief introduction to the types of approaches that researchers use to assess sleep in infants and children. In a different video, I discuss kids' nighttime sleep habits, and I also have one in which I discuss kids' daytime sleep habits. And finally, if your kid is having sleep problems and you want to know more about potential sleep interventions, then you can check out my video which looks at the evidence for common sleep strategies, another which looks at the evidence for bedtime routines, and finally, I have a video in which I look at the evidence for graded extinction, otherwise known as sleep training. But on to the recommended amount of sleep for infants and kids. So the two most highly cited sources concerning the recommended amount of sleep that kids should get across a 24-hour period are a consensus statement published by the American Academy of Sleep Science and a summary paper published by the US National Sleep Foundation. For each paper, developing the recommendations involved convening a panel of sleep experts who reviewed research investigating the association between sleep and health outcomes in infants and children. The outcomes of interest concern cognitive, emotional, and physical functioning, and the resulting recommendations reflect the consensus of these experts in terms of the amount of sleep a kid should get to try and maximize these health outcomes. So across the two papers, the recommendations didn't actually differ that much. So for kids aged 4 to 12 months, both papers recommended a minimum of 12 hours sleep. The maximum differed between the papers by 1 hour, but was on average 15.5 hours of sleep. Kids aged 1 to 2 years, both papers recommended between 11 to 14 hours of sleep. And for kids aged 3 to 5 years, both papers recommended between 10 to 13 hours of sleep. Now, the National Sleep Foundation paper also recommended that kids under the age of 4 months should get between 14 to 17 hours of sleep. However, the researchers noted that this recommendation was mostly based upon the experts' own experience or opinion, as there's little research investigating sleep and health outcomes in this age group. In contrast, the American Academy of Sleep Sciences decided not to provide a recommendation for kids under the age of 4 months because of the lack of research, and because the normal duration and patterns of sleep in this age group varies widely. And finally, the National Sleep Foundation paper also made suggestions for what may be an appropriate amount of sleep for some infants and children, which is kind of another way of saying we reckon they should get between X and Y, but if they get a little bit more or a little bit less, that's probably fine. So the range of appropriate amount of sleep ended up being 2 hours less than the recommended minimum and 2 hours more than the recommended maximum. So for example, the National Sleep Foundation recommends kids who are 4 to 12 months old should be getting 12 to 16 hours of sleep. But it might be appropriate for some kids to get between 10 to 18 hours. So now on to the evidence base for these sleep recommendations. So as mentioned, these sleep recommendations reflect the amount of sleep a kid should get to maximize cognitive, emotional, and physical health outcomes. However, as I'll touch on briefly, the evidence that underpins these sleep recommendations is not particularly strong, at least compared to that for older populations. Now, this problem was acknowledged in the National Sleep Foundation paper, with the authors noting that while there is some convincing evidence to support the recommendations, a good deal of the evidence is weak due to a reliance on self-report measures of sleep and study designs that don't enable strong conclusions concerning the causal role of sleep in health outcomes. That is, there was an over-reliance on correlational designs. And if you want to know more about correlation and causation, you can check out my video in the link below. Now, the same conclusion was reached by Chetwood, who conducted a systematic review of 69 papers investigating the relationship between sleep duration and health outcomes in kids between the ages of 0 to 4 years. The health outcomes included obesity, emotion regulation, cognitive development, growth, well-being, and motor development. And the results were as follows. For obesity, 20 studies have found that longer sleep duration is associated with lower rates of obesity, but 9 studies have found no such association, and 2 studies have actually found the opposite pattern. For emotion regulation, 13 studies have found that longer sleep duration is associated with better emotion regulation, but 10 studies have found no such association. And again, 2 studies have found the opposite pattern. For cognitive development, 6 studies have found that longer sleep duration is associated with better cognitive development, but 8 studies have found no such association, and 2 studies have found the opposite pattern. 2 studies have reported consistent evidence of an association between longer sleep duration and better physical growth. Lastly, no studies have shown an association between sleep duration and well-being or sleep duration and motor development, but there are only 1 and 2 studies respectively to go on. So Chaffett concluded that on balance, it appears that longer sleep duration is associated with lower rates of obesity, higher levels of emotion regulation, and better physical growth, at least in kids who are 0 to 4 years old. Now, to be honest, this is not the most objective way to be drawing conclusions, but it seems fair enough. Though I think given the mixed findings, I don't think you could be overly confident in these conclusions. At any rate, because there was no clear evidence to contradict the recommendations published by the American Academy of Sleep Science and the National Sleep Foundation, Chaffett argued that these recommendations should stay as is, at least for the moment. Now, of course, recommendations about the amount of sleep that kids should get will not necessarily align with the amount of sleep that kids actually get. So in the following, I'm going to take a look at research that's investigated the normative sleep patterns of infants and kids. But before doing so, I'll provide a very brief overview of the methodological approaches that researchers have used to assess sleep. So how do researchers assess sleep in infants and kids? So this section is going to provide some background information that will help put into context the research that I'm going to discuss. So in order to assess sleep in children and infants, researchers have used either objective measurements or parental self-reports. Now, in terms of objective assessment of sleep, polysomnography is considered the gold standard of sleep assessment, and it involves measurement of electrical brain activity, muscle activation, eye movements, breathing, oxygen saturation, and video recording of sleep behavior. However, for the kinds of studies I'll be reviewing, the more commonly used objective assessment approach is actigraphy. Actigraphy involves use of a device, kind of like a wristwatch, that continuously measures body movements. Now, the good thing about this approach is that it's a low-cost, unobtrusive method of assessment that enables objective measurement of sleep-wake patterns in the natural sleep environment. And typically, this can be done over an extended period. However, it doesn't provide as detailed information as polysomnography, and the data obtained can be compromised by artifacts arising from external movement. So for example, if the kid is asleep in the car and getting bumped around. And the approach can be somewhat insensitive to times when a kid is awake but motionless. So now onto the subjective self-report assessments of sleep. So sleep diaries and questionnaires are the most common self-report approaches used in sleep research in infants and kids. And basically, they involve parents subjectively reporting on whatever aspect of sleep researchers are interested in. So for example, sleep duration, night awakenings, and napping behaviors. Now, the advantage of self-report approaches is that they can be rolled out widely at relatively little cost. And depending upon the regularity of reporting required, they don't impose a particularly heavy burden on parents. Their major shortcoming is that parental reports are not great for some aspects of sleep. So for example, night waking. And to illustrate, I can remember waking up one night around about 2 p.m. and hearing my son chatting away to himself in his room. I had absolutely no idea how long he'd been awake for, and if I hadn't woken up, I wouldn't have even known that he'd been awake. So reliance on self-report can lead to inaccurate estimates of sleep. So now I'm going to talk about how much sleep do infants and kids actually get. So heaps of studies have examined this issue. And in this situation, researchers try to make sense of the data by conducting a meta-analysis, which is basically a statistical synthesis of the findings obtained across studies. Now, one meta-analysis I came across was by Gallen back in 2012. However, because this meta-analysis is a little old, I decided to run one of my own. So all I did was take the studies considered by Gallen, minus a few studies where it wasn't actually clear how the data could be used. And then I added in additional studies, most of which were post-2012. I wasn't exhaustive in my search for studies, and I'm sure there's some that I've missed, but nevertheless, my results are more up to date than Gallen. So I ended up with 23 studies for my meta-analysis. For the first 12 months of life, I mostly broke down the results into 2-month periods, and then from 1 year of age onwards, the results are broken into 6-month periods up until 3 years of age. Now, while I included 23 studies, each estimate of sleep duration was not actually based on data from all 23 studies. That is, some studies looked at kids across different ages, whereas others only looked at kids of a certain age, for example, 6-month-olds. On average, the estimates are based upon about 7 studies, with the average number of participants across these studies being about 1,600. And the last thing to mention is that, except for a couple of studies, estimates are based upon parental reports of sleep. So here are the results. First of all, this is the average number of hours of sleep that kids get across a 24-hour period. The error bars reflect standard deviation. Now, these averages are a way of representing the amount of sleep a typical kid gets, but they don't paint the full picture. One way of getting a more complete picture is to use percentile ranks. These ranks tell you the amount of sleep you would need to get to be sleeping more than a specified percentage of kids. I worked out the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentiles for each age range. And here they are. So to give a concrete example of how to interpret these percentile ranks, take a look at kids aged 1 month old. So the cutoff for the 10th percentile is about 11 hours. So if a kid is getting this amount of sleep, then they're getting more sleep than only 10% of kids. The cutoff for the 90th percentile is about 17 hours. So if a kid is getting this amount of sleep, then they're getting more sleep than 90% of kids. Now, 2 things to mention. First of all, I calculated these percentiles using the standard deviation. For this to work, you have to assume that sleep is normally distributed. I don't have access to the underlying data, so I can't be sure it's appropriate to assume a normal distribution. But the data recorded by Mindell suggests that this is a reasonable assumption. Second, these percentiles are not diagnostic. So if a kid falls into the extremes, upper or lower, that doesn't necessarily indicate that the kid has an underlying problem. In some cases, it may be indicative of a problem, but that's what we have health professionals for. So I'm now just going to expand a bit on an issue I was talking about earlier, which is the difference between parental self-reports and objective measures of sleep. Now, there does tend to be a high correlation between parental self-reports of sleep and objective measures, such as actigraphy. But from what I can see, parental self-reports tend to overestimate the amount of sleep kids get. And so to illustrate, when looking at the data from Hall, Quant, and Halal, parental self-reports of sleep duration across a 24-hour period were on average about 60 minutes higher than what you get from an actigraph measure of sleep duration. And as I mentioned, I think this makes sense because if parents are asleep and their kid is awake, then the parents aren't going to know. And so we'll end up thinking that the kid has slept for longer than they have. But you should always remember that actigraphy is also not perfect. No measure is. So for example, as mentioned, if a kid is awake but not moving around, then the actigraph measure will think they're asleep. Nevertheless, it seems reasonable to think that the estimates I've described above are a little inflated, given that they're mostly based upon self-report. So if you want to know more about sleep, as I mentioned, this article is one in a series focusing on kids' sleep. So if you want, you can also check out my video on nighttime sleep habits of kids and my other video looking at daytime sleep habits of kids. And lastly, if you want to know more about sleep interventions for kids, you can have a look at my video in which I look at the evidence for common sleep strategies, another video in which I look at the evidence for bedtime routines, and finally a video in which I look at the evidence for graded extinction, otherwise known as sleep trend. For the moment though, that's it for sleep recommendations. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.